Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 29, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Memphis wrestling tradition threatened by USWA ownership lawsuit. First ever UK only pay-per-view with famous Michaels Bulldog match. First ever Raw taping at MSG, and much more. By Observer staff. The prospective legal fight over the future of the USWA got messier during the week, resulting in no television show taped on September 20th in Memphis. As the week went on, the scorecards stood as follows. The 50% ownership group, an investment group headed by Mark Selker, had filed suit in federal court in Cleveland against the other 50% owner, Larry Burton, along with former owner Jerry Lawler, who had sold them their shares for $1 million, claiming fraud. They had claimed they had such a strong open and shut case that during the week they would get a temporary restraining order to keep Burton and Lawler from doing any business within the company. However, a Cleveland judge turned down their request. There was also talk they'd have criminal charges for fraud pressed against Lawler and Burton, but by the end of the week, no such charges were filed. Lawler was publicly claiming he was going to file a countersuit because the Selkers had stopped paying him on his $125,000 per year salaried front office position within the company he was contracted to when he sold them his stock. That he and Burton would attempt to get the other case moved to Memphis, and that they would attempt to disqualify Eugene Selker, father of Mark, from being the attorney in the case because of the conflict of interest, since he was both the attorney who drew up the papers for the sale of the company and the attorney who filed the lawsuit papers. Mark Selker attempted and failed to get a USWA house show on September 16th in Louisville canceled, headlined by Lawler vs. Tommy Dreamer, which drew a $4,000 house, about double what the company usually draws in that city. However, several other spot shows during the week were canceled, as was the television taping. The belief at press time is that Lawler and Burton would continue to run shows in Nashville and Louisville every week, and there are no plans announced for a return date in Memphis. During the week there had been talk that Lawler and Burton would bring in a crew of wrestlers for the scheduled Saturday morning taping at WMC TV studios in Memphis for airing at midnight, and that James Beard, a representative of the Selkers, would also bring in a crew of Dallas-based wrestlers, and nobody knew which group of wrestlers would end up appearing on the show. As late as the day before, it was believed that a wrestling show would be taped and a show had been scripted out. As it turned out, the Selkers managed to lock up the company's editing equipment, making it impossible for a show to be taped, and the program that aired on WMC TV had Beard in the studio doing lead-ins for random clips from USWA's past that had nothing to do with today's storyline. About the only comment, other than it being a totally dead show with no plugs or mentions about any future house show dates or talk of current angles, is that it appeared from the clips to be kissing up to Jerry Jarrett. They aired clips of Jarrett's mother Christine, who was fired by the Burton Group, being honored, and of Jerry Jarrett accepting an award for his late partner Tojo Yamamoto, along with favorable clips of Jeff Jarrett as a babyface. It was a 7-hour deposition that the Selkers had with Jarrett just prior to filing the suit that gave them the information about how much Lawler had purchased the other 50% of the company for and how much money the company had taken in when Jarrett was co-owner, and the huge profit Lawler had made in selling the company. Burton and his booker, Dutch Mantle, were going to attempt this week to get their own restraining order so they could get the video equipment from being locked up so they could tape a television show this weekend. If that restraining order fails to come through, it is expected that the show this weekend would be another old-time highlight show with Beard in the studio. Absolutely nobody seems to have a clue what is going to happen next week, but the show certainly put the television future of the promotion in jeopardy. There were several reports that WMC TV was unhappy about all the goings-on surrounding the wrestling show, and now with it airing Saturday nights at midnight, the ratings are way down, and patience with trying to salvage what had for years been the most popular local television show in the market was wearing thin within the station due to the problems with the power struggle and the idea that an armed guard came to the studio the previous week and a confrontation took place when Lawler and Burton were originally served. In addition, the syndication contract that USWA has with its generally weak lineup of UHF stations around the country calls for first-run programming 50 weeks per year. They are allowed recap shows during December for the holiday season, and this show was a clear violation of the contract. Even Lawler himself during the week called the time shift in Memphis as the kiss of death to the group in the market, particularly on the heels of the September 14th house show drawing just 207 fans to the Wrestling Observer hotline. The Selkers filed a suit asking for $1.5 million plus punitive damages from Lawler and Burton in federal court, claiming the two made false representation of facts when selling he and his investors the company. Apparently Selker claimed in the lawsuit to be the head of the group that controls 55% of the stock in the company, although most reports that have come out list the Selker Group and Burton as each controlling 50%. The crux of the situation is that Lawler and Jarrett each owned 50% of the company dating back to the early 80s. In December, Lawler purchased Jarrett's 50% for either $250,000 or $262,000, of which Jarrett himself received, depending upon the source, somewhere between $175,000 and $187,000, with the remaining $75,000 supposedly going to Burton for being the intermediary in the deal. Jarrett at the time was seriously thinking about folding the company, which was no longer profitable, and had openly said that receiving any money at that time for his stock in USWA he saw as a gift from above. The Selkers, who had raised $1.5 million to buy the company outright, were then told that Burton had purchased Lawler's 100% of the company for $2 million, $500,000 of which was paid immediately, and the remaining $1.50 would be forthcoming in 6 payments of $250,000 apiece. The Selkers began making payments to Burton for 50% of the company based on half the company being worth $1 million. If all of that is correct, then Lawler came out of it with money eventually promised to total $2 million for his original stock and the 50% that Jarrett owned, for which he paid theoretically Jarrett $250,000 or $262,000. The other key points are whether Burton actually paid Lawler the $500,000 in payments on the other $1.5 million at that price before selling half the company to the Selkers, and whether Lawler really paid Burton the $75,000. Where this gets even more intriguing is that the Selkers were given paperwork to show that Burton was working for USWA on a $750,000 per year salary plus performance bonuses. In other words, if all these allegations are correct and one were to put all the pieces together, it would appear that Lawler, the 100% owner of the company, was on paper paying Burton this ridiculous amount of money, the entire company grossed less than $500,000 from all sources in 1996, which then got kicked back to him as a huge purchase price for his shares, plus Lawler theoretically paid Burton $75,000 as the intermediary on the Jarrett deal, so there may be a paper trail of Lawler and Burton paying each other huge sums of money as salary and a brokering fee in one direction, and as the purchase price for the company in the other direction, with them using the same money to pay each other and thus little or no actual money changing hands, but making it on paper appearing to greatly inflate the actual value of the company. Lawler wouldn't confirm the $750,000 figure when asked, but has admitted to Pro Wrestling Torch that Burton was hired for a huge salary because he believed with the money from the Selkers being put into the company that USWA was going to greatly increase in business. Although he has changed his spin on the latter point 180 degrees over the past week, claiming the Selkers were people who got into a business they knew nothing about and were losing money hand over fist. It has been a common wrestling scheme of the past to use the money of outside money marks to fund wrestling companies. Another scheme, generally credited to former promoter Ron Fuller, Ronald Welch, although he assuredly wasn't the first to do it, was to sell his territory to outsiders who didn't understand the wrestling industry, who would then lose money like it was going out of style, and then after not making a go of it, sell the company back to Fuller at a much smaller price. Fuller would then buy it, build the territory back up, and sell it again to a new money mark for a higher price. He did this until he felt running territorial wrestling could no longer be profitable due to the changes in the industry as a whole caused largely by Vince McMahon, and is now a minor league ice hockey owner. It is believed the Selkers, who Lawler claimed raised $1.5 million from a group of investors to buy half the company but only paid $1 million for it, attempting to muddy the waters against the parties that have sued him, thought they'd make their money back largely from new revenue streams, mainly television syndicated ad sales, along with merchandising based on how WWF, ECW, and WCW were raking in money on that end and not predominantly from live event business. This would be in total contrast to the policies of Lawler and Jarrett as owners that kept USWA alive and profitable when all other regional offices had failed, basically spending almost no money at all and paying the guys $40 per night and $25 for television because there are always people around who are willing to almost pay to be television stars, or see it as paying dues with the hopes of being discovered by the big-time offices, and virtually all the money coming in came from selling tickets to live shows with the babyfaces able to add extra money to hustling their own gimmicks to fans. The payment structure had changed with the new ownership in that experienced wrestlers were getting $100 per night with the younger undercard guys getting $40, however the promotion was now controlling the merchandising, although little money was coming in from that direction. The new group went to the other extreme, with the idea of expanding into more bordering states along with spending money to theoretically make money from new revenue streams. They hired non-wrestling industry people as company executives at high salaries, some in excess of 6 figures, and rented a $3,000 per month office in Memphis, bought a new television set for $20,000 and were quickly realizing a lot of money was being spent and no money was coming in. The basic problem, the same that has faced everyone, remember AWF, POW, Global, et al., with the idea they'd make their money from national advertising sales as opposed to selling tickets, is that it just doesn't work. Few advertisers generally look at spending big money on pro wrestling, even if it gets good ratings. Those that do are already with WWF and/or WCW. If television syndication was such a cash cow, why was Titan Sports, at the time it was the leading company in the industry, at one point contemplating getting out of the syndication business because it was no longer cost-effective? If the brand name leader wasn't making a profit in syndication, how could a far smaller group expect to do so? Pro wrestling gets pennies on the dollar in advertising as compared with other shows that would do similar ratings with similar national penetration, which is one of the reasons USA Network preempts Raw with the US Open, despite it drawing only half the viewing audience every September. Despite hiring someone to sell national advertising at a 6-figure salary, the USWA had yet to sell one national ad spot, still had only one revenue stream, which was the house shows, which were bringing in virtually no money compared with the new overhead, was no longer being paid $1,500 per week by WMC-TV to pay for production of the show with the move to midnight. And it has been questioned who knew and how far in advance it was known about the move of TV time in the flagship city on the circuit. If this all winds up as nothing more than a power struggle between the Selker Group and Burton over control of the company, the natural question becomes, is the winner the real loser? Or is the loser the real winner? The World Wrestling Federation ran its first ever pay-per-view show primarily for the British market on September 20th before a sellout crowd of 11,000 fans at the NEC Arena in Birmingham, England. The show aired live in the United Kingdom, on tape delay on pay-per-view in Canada, and has been released for the US market on home video. Our reports indicated it was a very good show, with the final 3 matches being the highlight of the show, headlined by Shawn Michaels winning the European title from Davey Boy Smith in a match that Smith dedicated to his sister, Tracy, who came out to the ring with him and is suffering from bone cancer. The basic idea for this title change, making Michaels the first ever Grand Slam champion, WWF, IC, WWF Tag Team and European, in company history, appears to build up a second pay-per-view for the United Kingdom, likely coming from Smith's hometown of Manchester, England, sometime in the spring of 1998. It was the same promotional gimmick used by the WWF last year to build up the Royal Rumble pay-per-view where Shawn Michaels regained the WWF title in his hometown of San Antonio. The fact Michaels was given the title in the wake of the incident in Muncie, Indiana where he was swearing, nicely edited off television, calling out Undertaker who wasn't there, and running around in biker shorts and stuffing his crotch makes one wonder just how much Vince McMahon really didn't know about the incident beforehand. Throwing all that out from a pure business perspective, this is a viable tried and true wrestling angle, with a heartbreaking loss by the top babyface in that market to set up a return. If the Michaels deal wasn't an angle, which is something I'd be skeptical of at this point, then the WWF is stupid to put a belt on Michaels in the state he's in, not to mention his track record of how many times coming up with excuses and reasons to never drop back belts he's given. For WWF in England, the first pay-per-view show was expected to do well based on the novelty of it being the first non-boxing event ever on pay-per-view in the country, but it becomes less and less of a novelty with each successive show. Rather than waste having your largest expected audience with a blow-off, use the largest audience to do a major angle to try and keep it for the next show. But it doesn't appear that this title change was planned more than a week in advance unless the communication within the company has broken down, because on Raw 2 days after the switch, there were localized promos all over the country running for matches in October talking about Bulldogs matches as being European title matches. 1. Hunter Hearst Helmsley pinned Dude Love in 11 minutes with a pedigree. Love had Helmsley pinned with a double-arm DDT, but Chyna put his foot on the ropes. With Love distracted by Chyna, Helmsley used his move and got the win. 2. Tiger Ali Singh pinned Leif Cassidy in 6 minutes with a bulldog off the top rope. 3. Headbangers retained the WWF tag titles beating Savio Vega and Miguel Perez in 14 minutes when Mosh pinned Perez. 4. Patriot, who was said to have gotten the biggest heel reaction of anyone on the card, pinned Flash Funk in 8 minutes with the Uncle Slam, full Nelson drop. 5. Legion of Doom beat Godwins in 11 minutes when Hawk pinned Phineas after the double impact. They did an interview in the ring with Ken Shamrock, who was scheduled to face Owen Hart on the show. Shamrock said he couldn't wrestle due to a punctured lung suffered in his match in Muncie, Indiana with Farouk. The actual problem was a lung infection, which caused the bleeding from the mouth in both the Farouk match and the SummerSlam pay-per-view match against Bulldog, so it's a problem he's had for a while and not a ring injury. The doctor strongly recommended against him wrestling for 1 week until it cleared up, so his first match back will be on September 28 on the FMW Kawasaki Baseball Stadium show. Anyway, Rockabilly came out and ran down Shamrock and slapped him. Shamrock jumped on him and put an ankle lock submission on him until all the officials broke it up. 6. Vader pinned Owen Hart by reversing a cross body block into a power slam for the pin. This was said to have been a good match. Owen was the total face to the live crowd in this match. 7. Bret Hart retained the WWF title, beating Undertaker via DQ in about 28 minutes. Both men were cheered when they came out, but since crowds generally root for the challenger to win the title, as the match progressed, Undertaker received a total face reaction while Hart got a 50-50 reaction. Hart had done an interview earlier in the show totally kissing up to the fans and trying to make himself the face since the match story was built around him as the face. The finish wound up with Hart having the ropes wrapped around his neck, choking him, and Undertaker kept punching him until he was finally disqualified. Undertaker's attack was vicious enough that it finally got the crowd to turn on him. After the match, Undertaker choke slammed both the referee and a road agent. 8. Michaels beat Bulldog in 24 minutes. Even though Bulldog got a huge face reaction, Michaels' reaction was still 50-50. Rick Rude, Helmsley and Chyna all interfered freely during the match. The key spot was Smith attempting to deliver his running power slam while on the ringside floor, which was actually elevated on a platform. He stepped off the platform accidentally, blowing out his bad knee. Michaels worked on the leg, including removing his knee brace. He used the figure 4, with Helmsley and Rude holding his arms to add leverage when ref Earl Hebner ruled him unable to continue. They did the same gimmick which got Austin over so big as a face, where they're pushing that Bulldog never submitted in the match. After the match, Michaels put the figure 4 on again until Diana Smith hit the ring. Chyna went after her, which brought Bret and Owen out to clear the ring. By this point the crowd was in a near riot pitch, throwing bottles and cans all over the building and the ring filled with debris, but the situation was said to have become quite dangerous. It was almost as if it was the final hurrah for the All Japan Women's promotion, and the fans, seeing that the end may be near, drew a surprising legitimate sellout of 4,100 to the Kawasaki City Gymnasium on September 21st. The crowd was even more impressive since it came the day after the Gia promotion ran the same gym with the biggest show in its history and also sold it out, and came 1 week before the FMW Stadium show in the same city, about halfway between Tokyo and Yokohama, that is expected to draw around 35,000 fans. After the main event, in which the group's tag team champions Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda, in a non-title match, put over Kaoru Ito and Tomoko Watanabe in a cage, the 11 wrestlers who are staying with the promotion, with the key ones being Ito, Watanabe, Manami Toyota, Yumiko Hata, Kumiko Makawa, and Takako Inoue, got into the ring and proclaimed they would rebuild the company. In the semifinal, Hata, the current WWA champion, went to a 30-minute straw with Toyota in a non-title match. It was the final match for Mita and Shimoda, along with prelim wrestlers Yuka Shina, Saya Endo, and Shaparita Asari. The women who quit have all done so largely because they are months behind in getting paid their salaries. However, many of them will on occasion work within this promotion on sold shows to local promoters, in which they'll work for a one-shot guaranteed payoff, with their names being demanded by the local promoters. As Mita, Shimoda, Asia Kong and Kyoko Inoue all have bookings with AJW on road shows this coming week. Many of them will also be working for the other women's offices in Japan on a per-shot basis. Reports are that the 4 Matsunaga brothers who own the company are going to sell all their real estate holdings and still claim they'll make up the money owed. The eventual fallout looks to be the addition of 2 more women's promotions in Japan. Kyoko Inoue looks to be starting her own group in November, of which she'll be the president, booker and top star in. That will also include Mita, Shimoda and Endo as strong heels, and Yoshiko Tamura, Shina, Misai Genki and Tiny Mouse as faces. Another group, which will include the other wrestlers that have left the group, headed by Marco Yoshida, is expected to start in January and supposedly introduce a new concept to the women's wrestling world, whatever that means. Dick the Bulldog Brower, a journeyman heel who wrestled for 25 years mainly in the Northeast and Canada, passed away on September 16 at the age of 63. Brower, whose real name was Richard Gland, although he'd gone under the name Dick Brower for so long that nearly everyone in wrestling assumed it was his real name, had been suffering from diabetes the past few years and passed away after a heart attack in Canada. Originally from Wilmington, Delaware, he was a bodybuilder, winning the title of Mr. Delaware in 1954, before starting in pro wrestling in 1957. At 5'10" and 265 pounds, looking far more like a powerlifter than a bodybuilder, he fit into the top of the heel ranks in the WWF with runs during the 60s and 70s, which was built around powerful, and generally not very mobile, men. Brower's interviews, talking with bug eyes and doing a crazy act about Brower power, and doing a gimmick where he claimed to be one of the world's strongest wrestlers, were far more notable than his actual wrestling, which from all accounts wasn't very good. He was a regular opponent of Bruno Sammartino both before and during his first reign as WWF champion. The Sammartino-Brower feud started just before Sammartino's first title reign, with singles and tag matches in both the Buffalo and Toronto circuits in late 1962 and 1963. Brower, billed as the Delaware Destroyer, often formed a tag team with Hans Schmidt and later with Johnny Valentine, while Sammartino headlined Buffalo with local star Ilio Di Paolo, and Toronto with local legend whipper Billy Watson. He also headlined that area during that time period against the likes of Valentine, Watson, Billy Red Lions, Jim Hottie and Sammy Steamboat, and even had a few NWA title matches against Lou Thez. He also had a hot feud with former tag team partner Sweet Daddy Siki. He was always a much bigger star in Canada, since at the time Frank Tunney's Maple Leaf Wrestling was broadcast in other parts of Canada, then in the Northeast, and was once even the subject of a documentary on a CBC News magazine show. His first WWF run as a headliner came during the spring of 1966, with several title shots, the biggest being on November 7, 1966, losing to Sammartino's backbreaker submission in Madison Square Garden. He made a second WWF run, headlined by a November 16, 1970 Madison Square Garden loss to Sammartino when the match was stopped on blood. He returned for a few tours afterwards, but no longer as a headliner. In 1975, when Eddie Einhorn, with the help of longtime Buffalo/Cleveland promoter Pedro Martinez, attempted to run a national wrestling promotion in opposition to both the WWF and the NWA, Brower was brought into feud with Mighty Igor as a top undercard feud. Due to many of the top wrestlers jumping back to mainstream WWF and NWA promotions, he quickly became the number 2 heel behind Ivan Koloff. Although the IWA had one famous show at Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey that drew in excess of 15,000 fans in a rainstorm, the venture was a colossal money-losing failure. When Koloff was raided back to the WWF, this left Brower as the top opponent for champion Mil Mascaras, and given the style clashes, you can imagine how those matches must have been. After Mascaras left the promotion, Brower was billed in many cities as the IWA World Champion, and held the group's North American Championship as well, staying with the group from its attempt at being a national company to when it became a small-time regional office based in the Carolinas, before it finally folded. Brower retired from wrestling in 1982, and gained some infamy outside of wrestling as being a leader in hate-mongering white supremacist racist groups, including appearing on radio commercials for the Ku Klux Klan. He had a son who was a good amateur wrestler, who he tried to get into pro wrestling in the early 90s but didn't make it, only doing a few matches at Bulldog. Brower Jr. His final appearances in wrestling were as manager of Terry Funk for Joel Goodhart's Tri-State Wrestling in Philadelphia, the forerunner of today's ECW. The question of whether the WWF going live or on tape has anything to do with the ratings has been answered many times over in the past. The answer is it has nothing to do with it, because the virtual entirety of the television audience that watches wrestling doesn't follow the product close enough to even know when shows are live or on tape, and those who do follow it that closely are going to watch the taped show anyway. The unanswered question for this week is whether the venue, in this case a sellout crowd at Madison Square Garden in New York, the most famous arena in the world and the most populous city in the country, makes a difference. Shocking to many, the answer in this case was also a resounding no. The WWF Raw show, with all the New York hype over the past month plus about this being an extra special show, and a lot of work in pre-production being done with taped historical features to add to the atmosphere of what was largely a very good television show on September 22nd from MNSG, drew a 2.33 rating, 2.35 first hour, 2.30 seconds hour, and 3.49 share. That compares with a 2.54 rating on September 15th, with a taped show coming from Muncie, Indiana with far less hype. Even more depressing from a WWF standpoint, and astounding is that when Nitro went off the air at 10:16 p.m. Eastern Time, that the Raw audience showed almost no growth, and wound up averaging a 2.33 for the 3 segments after Nitro was off the air, the same exact average it had for the 5 head-to-head segments. This meant that of the basically 2.6 million homes watching Nitro, that's statistically none, which translated means so few it isn't statistically significant to even mean, and 0.1 rating differential, of those homes tuned to USA. The general feeling when the new season started with the new time slot for Raw was that it would get beaten during the head-to-head segments by Nitro, as has been happening the past year plus, but it would pick up greatly in the ratings with the Nitro lead-in once Nitro goes off the air. That has happened in the past, but didn't occur at all this week. The MSG show drew 14,615 fans, packing the building cut down in seats to the taping television, with 10,672 paying $258,339 and another $97,720 in merchandise. While there have been larger paid attendances for live Raw tapings, with the high New York ticket prices, this was a bigger live gate than at any Raw, or for that matter Nitro, taping in history. The other pattern becoming prevalent in the new season is that Nitro now peaks every week from 8:45 to 9 p.m., and does lose a fraction of its audience when Raw and Monday Night Football, and probably more the latter than the former, begin. Although Nitro's ratings remain tremendously impressive against the football competition, there is also a pattern of viewers declining as the show goes on. The drop at 9 p.m. should be expected and easily explainable, but the huge drop every week before the main events the show is being built around, when in the past the company did phenomenal final quarter numbers, is a telling sign. Perhaps it's been too many weeks without Sting on television doing an end of the show fly-in. Perhaps people have seen the fly-in so much that they don't need to stick around for it anymore, even though it's no longer happening. Probably the wrestlers they've been using to anchor the main events of late, in particular Curt Hennig the past 2 weeks and Diamond Dallas Page and Lex Luger the weeks before that, are either not over as mainstream TV draws in the case of Hennig or have had their characters flattened out by recent angles in the case of the other two. Nitro on September 22nd did a 3.69 rating, 3.83 first hour, 3.58 seconds hour, and 5.57 share, which means the head-to-head 5 segments saw Nitro winning 3.58 to 2.33. Nitro Replay did a 1.6 rating and 3.0 share. Nitro Peak was a 4.4 for the segment involving Scott Hall's 6, Larry Zbyszko and the Quickie match with Hector Garza. The rating stayed strong with the second highest segment of 4.0 for the 8-man Lucha match and the Piper interview, despite the start of Raw, 2.1 for MSG Nostalgia Clips, Ahmed Johnson vs. Rocky Maivia and Austin interview from the stands, and football. From that point Nitro dropped to a 3.6, Steiners vs. Meng and Barbarian, to Raw's 2.3, Undertaker and Michaels interview, followed by a Nitro 3.8, Hogan and Bischoff interview, Savage vs. Richards, to a Raw 2.4, LOD vs. Farouk and Kama, a Nitro 3.2, Raven attacking Richards, Conan and Norton vs. Booker T, to a Raw 2.6, Owen vs. Pillman and Austin using the stunner on McMahon, and finally a Nitro 3.3, Hennig vs. Jarrett and typical NWO finish, to a Raw 2.2, first half of Cactus Jack vs. Helmsley. The second half of Cactus vs. Helmsley, despite it being an excellent match and Nitro ending, still only drew a 2.2 and the unopposed rating grew only to a 2.3 for the Michaels interview and Undertaker confrontation and 2.5 for Brett vs. Goldust main event. Japanese television rundown. August 13th Rings 1. Mitsuya Nagai beat Mikhail Simov in 6:38. This match was mainly standing and it was worked to look like a shoot. The main telling sign during the body of the match is that Simov was taking something off of his punches whenever he went to the head, which it was legal for him to do since he was wearing gloves. On their feet Simov appeared to be the stronger fighter of the two even though Nagai was the one going over. The finish stemmed from 2 screw-ups in the match. Simov was throwing hard kicks and he accidentally kicked Nagai low twice, both times having to halt the match while Nagai recovered. After the second one, for obvious reasons, they went right to the finish which looked totally fake where Nagai did this easy takedown and he'll hold that Simov let him have, too. Wataru Sakata beat Minoru Tanaka of Battlerts in 5:03 with a front guillotine in a battle for third place in the under 209 weight class tourney. This was a shoot, and as it turned out, the only one on the card, with Sakata being the stronger of the two. But it was a good match. 3. Masayuki Naruse beat Christopher Hazement to become the first under 209 champion. This was a good match in that it looked very close to legit. The pro wrestling booking where they threw in far too many submissions and rope breaks back and forth to run down their points and create excitement was obvious. Both men were down to their final points when Naruse got a knockdown with a straight palm to the face at 14:26 and Haseman was out of points. Crowd wasn't super into it because the two aren't big stars, but it was a very good match. 4. Hansa Nyman beat Kiyoshi Tamura in 9:03 when Tamura ran out of points. There was a 59-pound weight difference between the two, 246 to 187, and because Nyman isn't that great on the ground but very good standing, they did most of the match standing. Tamura's strength is on the ground, and he did show brief glimpses of his brilliance, but mainly was overpowered fighting out of his game. Pretty one-sided, which is in a sense a surprise because of how much Tamura gets pushed, but logical given they did most of the match standing with Nyman kicking the hell out Tamura in a very believable-looking fashion, but well below the level of most of Tamura's matches. 5. Akira Maeda beat Tsuyoshi Kosaka in 9:14 with a front guillotine. This match looked more real, it wasn't, than most of Maeda's matches. But it wasn't exciting at all, even though Kosaka probably ranks right with Han and Tamura as the best worker in the company. 6. Yoshihisa Yamamoto beat Folk Han in 11:30 when Han ran out of points after being knocked down with a series of kicks to the head. Han is a total artist on the ground and may be the best technical wrestler in the world today. The two traded submissions, with Yamamoto also using striking. Excellent main event that the crowd was really into, with Yamamoto putting on his best performance in a long time with the upset over the group's top-rated guy after several knockdowns. August 30th, All Japan. 1. Kenta Kobashi beat Hiroshi Hase in 32:49 after 3 spinning chops and a lariat. About half the match aired on television, and in this form it was an excellent match. Since these two are both experts at building, it was probably even better unedited. 4 stars. 2. Steve Williams and Gary Albright retained the tag titles, beating Mitsuharu Misawa and Jun Akiyama in 8:42 when Albright scored a surprise pin on Misawa with the Dragon Suplex. A super match because all four were in a sprint, throwing everything out there in a short period of time. Since they weren't going long, Albright didn't get tired out and basically was launching the guys into orbit whenever he threw his suplexes. Just one great move after another, all of which meant something in the context of where they were going. 4 1/4 stars. August 31st, All Japan Women. 1. Kong went to a 30 minutes draw with Toyota. About 20 minutes aired on television, and it was another Toyota special. It was probably better live since Toyota's matches are usually tons better in unedited form than televised form. Since it was Kong's last major match with the company, suffice to say they pulled out all the stops. The post-match retirement, or graduation ceremony, was a letdown on television, just a few women bringing flowers and nothing compared to what they've done in the past, which is too bad since Kong is one of the biggest stars in the history of women's wrestling. 4.5 stars. 2. Hata won the WWA title from Kyoko Inoue with an armbar. Even with Inoue giving away she was dropping the title by announcing just as the show started that she was leaving, she wanted to go out with a great match. It was her best performance in a long time. Great near falls and submissions which built perfectly to the finish. Tremendous heat as well. Finish saw Inoue deliver 4 power bombs in a row, to the point the crowd actually believed she was going to win, and on the way down Hata caught her arm in the armbar. They were building to the armbar finish the entire match, so it was a perfect climax. 4.5 stars. 3. Mita and Shimoda beat Watanabe and Maekawa in a 2 out of 3 fall match to retain the WWA tag titles. This, from an in-ring standpoint, was the best wrestling television show of the year, and based on the 3 matches that aired, the best main event matches on any individual big wrestling show of the year. The irony being, of course, it was for a promotion that is on its last legs and all of the women in these matches were way behind on being paid. Yet it didn't in the least negatively affect their effort in the ring, and many of them are now no longer even with the company. All 3 TV matches were fantastic and all totally different. Toyota's match featured all the spectacularness of big moves and emotion of a legend in her last bout with the company. Hata's match was perfectly built and executed when it came to psychology, ending with a world title change. And this was a great brawl, but with tons of great in-ring moves and execution thrown in. First fall was only 53 when Shimoda actually hitting Watanabe so hard with the chair that the bottom flew out, and Mita pinned her after 2 Death Valley bombs. Second fall saw Watanabe use her screwdriver on Mita, and Maekawa, who has a buzz haircut, bleached blonde, and actually looks more like a young heel male wrestler, delivered an axe kick for the pin. Maekawa bladed her elbow in this fall, just before taking a chair shot to the elbow from Shimoda. Maekawa's kicks were incredible, including one stiff shot to the face that would make you cringe that anyone would actually do it. Shimoda pinned Maekawa in the third fall after 2 tiger superplexes. 4 1/4 stars. September 6, New Japan. 1. Tenzan beat Hashimoto in the semifinals of the G1 in 14:01. Tenzan makes these matches for his willingness to take the most brutal kicks from Hashimoto. He bled from the mouth after eating a kick. This was better than the Nagoya Dome match except for a screw-up near the finish. Tenzan delivered 2 headbutts off the top rope, and went up for a third, but lost his balance, fell off at a bad angle, and nearly killed himself, hurting his ankle in the process. He was actually motionless on his head with his ankle caught between the turnbuckle and rope, and had to be unloosened. After a few more spots, they went right back to the finish with 2 more headbutts off the top. 3 1/2 stars. 2. Sasaki beat Norton with a Northern Lights bomb in 5:16. A good match considering who was involved. They traded near falls at the end and the crowd was popping pretty big. 2 3/4 stars. 3. Sasaki won the tournament over Tenzan 8:09 with the Northern Lights bomb. The announcers were putting it over as the protege of Choshu against the protege of Chono, who were last year's finalists. With his switching to short blank trunks, with a similar hair and physique, in certain angles Sasaki does look and wrestle like a young Choshu but doesn't have the charisma of a young Choshu. Tenzan was injured from his previous match and really had to gut it out. He was wincing with every step, although it wasn't a work because the ankle never played a part in the match and he did everything he would have done fighting the pain. It was short but turned into a really dramatic match with great heat. Both kicked out of the other's big moves. Tenzan again bled from the mouth. All the wrestlers at ringside rooted the guys on. At the end the two were on the mat ram-butting each other. Tenzan got a huge pop kicking out of a Northern Lights bomb at 1 but then Sasaki hit another lariat and bomb for the pin. Tenzan had himself quite a tournament, showing he's a lot better worker than many give him credit for being, particularly working the final hurt. And even with the incredible push, it still seems the fans recognize that while Sasaki can have good matches, he just isn't what he's being promoted as being either from an ability or charisma perspective. 3 3/4 stars. September 7th, All Japan. 1. Misawa beat Akiyama in 24:57 to retain the Triple Crown. This was a weird match. Technically it was a tremendous match. No missed moves, they worked together fluidly, and the match built with great psychology. Basically it was exactly what you'd expect, if not better, from these two in their first ever singles match for the title. However, the crowd was dead. It wasn't as if they appeared not to like the match, or even if they were dead because they believed Akiyama had no chance to win the match. It just appeared to be like one of those early 70s Japanese crowds, with a lot of older fans, where people packed the building to watch the spectacle of a world title match, but the reactions were tepid. Really a super match, although it asked some interesting questions about the future of the promotion with a lack of reaction to a first-time main event where the work rate was so high. At the same time, from a business perspective, it asks another question. Which is better for both the short and long term, an excellent main event before 1,500 fans with tons of reaction, or an excellent main event before 15,000 fans with little crowd reaction? 4 stars. September 13th, New Japan. 1. Otani pinned Samurai to win the J Crown in 1815. This show was taped from the Nagoya Dome. The last 12 minutes aired. Typical excellent match between these two. Otani really carried it from a personality standpoint, and won his biggest match of his career after a springboard into a DDT and a dragon suplex. He really put it over crying in the post-match. 4 stars. 2. Fry beat Cal Worsham in 7:35 by tying up his legs and choking him. Match had almost no heat. It was worked to look like a shoot and there were some decent flurries when each got the other down and pounded to their back and they traded suplexes. 1/2 of 1 star. 3. Sasaki and Yamazaki beat Nakanishi and Kojima to win the IWGP Tag titles in 12:31 when Sasaki pinned Nakanishi after a Northern Lights bomb while Yamazaki had Kojima in an armbar. Really stiff. Not flashy at all, but an overall hard-looking New Japan-style match with the hard slaps and kicks, solid wrestling and good build to the finish. 3 stars. Puerto Rico. Jungle Jim Steele returned between All Japan tours as the top opponent for Ray Gonzalez's Universal title. Steele replaced Sean Morley, who wrestles as Steele in Mexico. Sound confusing enough yet? Since Morley left Puerto Rico, both wrestle for All Japan. The Freebirds, who were supposed to have started last weekend, were billed as being Terry Gordy and Michael Hope, whomever that will turn out to be. They were pushing the next major show on September 27th in Caguas called Bombazo 97. Mexico. The only news we have is that the September 19th 64th anniversary show at Arena Mexico drew a sellout of 17,100. There was some papering for El Hijo del Santo beating Negro Casas in a mask versus hair match. We were told the match was an old-style match with lots of mat work and lasting more than 30 minutes. It's the first Arena Mexico sellout since the Atlantis vs. Mono Negra mask versus mask match several years ago. Meng and Barbarian from WCW were there unadvertised and did a run-in attacking Los Hermanos Dinamita to start a Mexico vs. Foreigners feud. This was a major political move in Mexico since EMLL promoter Paco Alonso had been promising his wrestlers work in the US for months, but it had never materialized, and he was losing all his talent to Promo Azteca, since it clearly had the WCW connection through Conan. There is the expected heat from the Promo Azteca group and Conan, who now controls 40% of the stock in that promotion, for WCW sending Meng and Barbarian to work with their opposition. With Alonso able to book 2 wrestlers from WCW, it shows that he also has connections with WCW. It is believed Meng and Barbarian will be sent to Mexico now to work major shows. Vampiro will be starting with CMLL, affiliated with EMLL, jumping from Azteca, after he recovers from getting his knee scoped. Also jumping of late from Azteca to CMLL have been Angel Azteca, Super Electra Enigma, and Black Dragon. It is also rumored that Alonso is close to signing Blue Panther, Fuerza Guerrera, Heavy Metal, and perhaps even Perro Aguayo, which would really be a major nail in Antonio Pena's coffin if all 4 would jump. With Steel having jumped to Azteca, the CMLL heavyweight title will be up in a tournament that started on September 23rd at Arena Coliseo and will last several weeks. For those into real names, the real name of Atlantis is Alfonso Vega Lopez and Dr. Wagner Jr. is Juan Manuel Gonzalez Barron. Major shows this week on September 26th at Arena Mexico has Rayo de Jalisco Jr. at Atlantis and Brazo de Plata vs. Cien Caras and Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr., Mr. Niebla and Felino and Brazo de Oro vs. Bestia Salvaje and El Satanico and Scorpio Jr. Same night in Naucalpan for the Azteca TV taping has Conan and T. Nieblas Jr. and Lismark Jr. and Parca vs. Pierroth Jr. and Black Warrior and Black Magic and Silver King. Super Astro and Mr. Aguila and Oro Jr. and Pantera vs. Super Crazy and El Texano and Dandy and Juventud Guerrera, and Solero and Torero and Super Muñeco and Super Colo vs. Ultimo Guerrero and Ultimo Rebelde and Pantera del Ring and Mosco de la Merced. Pena officially this week introduced Leon Negro as the AAA Psicosis with the exact same ring outfit. Expect that one to wind up in court. All Japan. A few changes from the lineups listed in last week's Observer for the next tour. The tour opens September 27th at Korakuen Hall with Mitsuharu Misawa and Jun Akiyama and Manukia Mossman versus the Triangle of Power, Steve Williams and Gary Albright and the Lacrosse, on top. September 28th at Korakuen Hall features the first ever teaming to Misawa and Jinsei Shinzaki facing Akiyama and Satoru Asako. September 29th Matsumoto lineup remained the same. October 1st in Osaka won't have Misawa vs. Toshiaki Kawada in a singles match nor Mossman vs. Daisuke Ikeda in a single, but still have the All-Asian Tag title with Akiyama and Takao Mori vs. Johnny Smith and Sean Morley. The top matches are now Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace and Masao Inoue vs. Top and Misawa and Mossman vs. Ikeda and Kawada. They've added on October 4th in Nagoya a match with Misawa and Giant Baba and Asako vs. Kawada and Akira Tao and Masa Fuchi. A correction on October 21st from Budokan Hall, it'll be Kawada vs. Yoshihiro Takayama of Kingdom in a singles match, and not vs. Akiyama as listed last week. They've also added Stan Hansen and Baba and Jumbo Tsuruta vs. Amori and Tamon Honda and Inoue. Hansen was cut back from 7 tours a year to 5 in 1998, which appears to be a cost-cutting measure since Hansen is the highest-paid foreigner but no longer a headliner. Great Sasuke will be working a few shows as a special guest during the Tag Team Tournament Tour. September 7th TV show did a 2.5 rating. New Japan. The shows this week largely revolved around a teased babyface turn that hasn't materialized of yet with Great Muta. It started during the Tag Team Tournament with Muta and Hiroyoshi Tenzan as a team. On September 18th in Tokuyama, they beat Osamu Kido and Junji Hirata. During the match, Tenzan held Kido and Muta came off the top with a chop, but Kido moved and Mita hit Tenzan. The two started arguing, but while it was going on, Muta blew the green mist in Kido's eyes and pinned him. But the two argued after the match. On September 19 in Okayama during a six-man tag, Muta teamed with Masahiro Chono and NWO Sting against Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura and Akira Nagami. Chono accidentally gave Muta his Yakuza kick and Muta walked out of the match, although the NWO team still won when NWO Sting pinned Kimura. On September 20 in Nagoya before 9,500 fans, capacity is 13,000, with the show coming just 6 weeks after the Nagoya Dome show and nothing special in the lineup, it figured to be hard to draw the usual New Japan sellout. Muta and Tenzan faced IWGP Tag Champs Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in the finals of the three-gun tag team tournament. Muta and Tenzan had problems during the match, and at the finish, Tenzan was on the top rope ready to give his headbutt to Yamazaki, but Muta blew the mist in his eyes. As he fell to the ground, Yamazaki clamped on an armbreaker and the ref stopped the match at 15:21 with Sasaki adding to his collection of big wins, IWGP Singles, Tag Team, G1 Climax and Tag Team Tournament wins, over the past 7 weeks. On September 21 in Hamamatsu, Muta and NWO Sting faced Fujinami and Nagami. 5 minutes into the match, Muta accidentally chopped NWO Sting. Muta then washed his face paint off, but stayed at ringside, while Sting pinned Nagami to win the match. Muta then talked out by himself. Then on September 22 in Niigata, Muta and NWO Sting faced former tag champs Manabu Nakanishi and Satoshi Kojima. During this match, Muta and Sting never had any problems. Muta worked as a total heel, but after the match was over, Muta walked out on Sting. This was all a build for the September 23 Budokan Hall match with Sasaki and Yamazaki facing Muta and Chono in a non-title match before 12,800 fans. Muta and Chono came to the ring with the entire NWO group of Tenzan, Hiro Saito, Marcus Bagwell and NWO Sting with his trademark black baseball bat. Muta wouldn't go in the corner with the NWO group before the match and stayed in a neutral corner. Muta and Chono worked fine as a team early until Chono accidentally hit Muta with a flying shoulder tackle. Muta went down outside the ring and began washing off his face paint again. He then left to the dressing room. While this was going on, the NWO members all attacked Sasaki and Yamazaki, with Sting giving the bat to Chono, who used it on both opponents. As Chono hit Sasaki in the STF, Muta did the quick change and showed up Sans Muta gimmick as Keiji Muto in his trademark orange short trunks. Muto and Chono stared at each other nose to nose, but before any blows were thrown, Muto instead dropkicked Sasaki, gave him the trademark power elbow and a moonsault for the finish at 17:58. Muto then got an NWO t-shirt from a fan at ringside and put it on and shook hands with all the members of the NWO team. The top matches at Budokan involved former UFC fighters. Zane Frazier, who didn't look good, lost to Shinya Hashimoto in the main event via triangle choke at 1:05 of round 3. Brian Johnston, who was unknown in Japan but looked impressive, lost to Naoya Ogawa with a sleeper in 11:14. Don Frye scored another win in his rematch with Kazuyuki Fujita in 6:02 with a choke. Also Shintaro Otani retained the J Crown beating Tatsuhito Takaiwa in 15:01 with a dragon suplex, and in the Junior War, Jushin Liger and Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, and El Samurai beat Dr. Wagner Jr. and Koji Kanemoto and Chris Jericho. Riki Choshu's farewell match in his hometown of Tokuyama on September 18 drew a sellout 6,500 teaming with Sasaki to beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Nagami. After the match, Choshu said he didn't want to wait until the January 4 Tokyo Dome to face Sasaki, and asked for a non-title match with Sasaki on November 2 at the Fukuoka Dome, which is the likely main event. It now looks like Choshu will face Ogawa in his Tokyo Dome retirement match. This gives Choshu the chance to put Sasaki over before retiring, if he chooses to do so, as he's never lost to Sasaki in a singles match yet, and he's clearly grooming Sasaki to be his reincarnation, and still theoretically win his retirement match. The planned October 19 Kobe match with Hashimoto vs. K1 star Branko Sikatic appears to be off, since Sikatic will instead work on the Pride 1 show on October 11 at the Tokyo Dome against Ralph White, billed as a kickboxer from the US, in an NHB-style match. In the tag team tournament, on September 17 in Osaka before 4,800 at Mess Arena, Muta and Tenzan beat Fujinami and Nagami, and Hashimoto and Tadao Yasuda beat Kojima and Nakanishi when Yasuda scored a surprise pin on Kojima. Muta and Tenzan earned a berth in the finals with a September 18 Tokuyama win over Kido and Hirata, while Sasaki and Yamazaki got to the finals beating Hashimoto and Yasuda on September 19 in Okayama when Yamazaki used the Fujiwara armbar on Yasuda. September 6 TV show did a 2.9 rating. Other Japan notes. Taka Michinoku returned to Michinoku Pro Wrestling on September 17 in Mito, attacking Great Sasuke to set up their main event on October 10 at Sumo Hall, which will be a street fight match. Michinoku, with manager Victor Quiñones, attacked Sasuke after he had beaten Shuichi Funaki in a singles match, giving him the Michinoku Driver 2 and grabbed the house mic and challenged him to the main event at Sumo Hall. Sasuke was scheduled against an opponent to be picked by the WWF, and as the story goes, was told that the WWF had picked Michinoku. The next morning in an angle, Taka and Quiñones destroyed Sasuke's $150,000 Cadillac limo in front of the company offices in Morioka, with Sasuke and members of the company front office in the car discussing business. Sasuke ran out after them, but they ran off. They are doing the angle where Quiñones has said that Taka will sign with the WWF. They also did an angle at the September 16 FMW house show at Korakuen Hall where Quiñones attacked referee Ted Tanabe, who is one of the key members of the Michinoku front office. Another change in the October 10 show is that what was originally 2 singles matches has turned into a tag match with Tiger Mask and Gran Hamada vs. Convict and Chris Condito. Pancrase announced already that on December 20 at Yokohama Bunka Gym that Yuki Kondo will make his next title defense against Masakatsu Funaki. Terry Funk returned to FMW on September 22 in Yamazaki, teaming with Mr. Genasuke to beat Hayabusa and Koji Nakagawa in the main event for the week leading up to Kawasaki Stadium. Gia's biggest show in its history on September 20 at the Kawasaki City Gym drew a sellout 4,300 as Devil Masami captured the WCW Women's title, beating Zero Shigusa Nagio doing a heel gimmick. Akira Hokuto, who was the champion, had to vacate the title due to her injuries. After Masami won the match, she walked out of the ring without being presented with or taking the WCW belt. Hokuto had talked with Masami of late about working together for the title in the US, but at the time Masami wasn't interested. Nagio as herself beat Asia Kong to retain her All-World Women's title in 9:28 via submission in the first ever singles meeting between the two. 18-year-old Sugar Sato captured the WCW Women's Cruiserweight title from Yoshiko Tamura on the same show. Takako Inoue returns to All Japan Women from her eye injury on October 8. Here and there. WWO has a show scheduled on September 28 at the Chino, California Fairgrounds, located between Pomona and San Bernardino, at 4 p.m. with Mil Mascaras and Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Kanan and Psicosis and Yokozuna, a lumberjack strap match with Silver King and Super Colo and Super Muñeco vs. Damien, and Doink the Osborne, and Juventud Guerrera. Salsero and Pandilleros 2 and 3 vs. Phobia and Mr. Tempest, and Piloto Suicida plus local minis and women. I do know that WCW is against Kanan and Mysterio Jr. doing the show, and for that matter, even them working in Mexico at all at this point because of the fear of injury. Particularly in the case of Mysterio Jr. Hector Garza will probably replace Mysterio Jr. and I'm not sure who will be sent from Mexico to replace Kanan. They are also looking at dates on October 10 in Tijuana, October 11 in either Chicago or El Paso, and October 12 in Chino, although none should be labeled as anything more than perspective. The latest on Sid Audi is that he's back training. His neck is almost completely healed from his surgery, but his hip is still giving him problems. They took bone from his hip to reconstruct his neck, which was injured both in the ring and from the auto accident. He won't be able to wrestle until January and is hoping to go to WCW at that time. The lawyers are still fighting over his WWF status. What we've gathered from WCW is that they'd be interested in him if too many of the wrestlers didn't complain. He had heat in the past not only with the Nash faction, but also with the Flair/Anderson faction, and Hogan has never been fond of him either, and try and stand in the way. And even then, only on a per-night deal and not a guaranteed contract due to his track record. Devon Storm is out of action with a broken hand. Blast from the past department. Brian Adias, Brian Gower, the one-time high school best friend of Kerry Von Erich, has been back wrestling the past few weeks on the CWA shows in Dallas, managed by Skander Akbar and using the Oriental Tool Punch as his finisher. This all stemmed from many years ago when Kevin Von Erich passed out in the ring and nearly died and needed CPR from Tommy Rogers. At the time he collapsed, he was wrestling Adias. They created an angle where Adias had been taught this deadly punch to the throat and nearly killed Kevin with it, and for a while it became his finishing hold. Josh Wilcox, a former tight end at the University of Oregon who was cut in camp this year by the Minnesota Vikings, who tried to convert him to linebacker, makes his pro debut for Matt Osborne's Portland Wrestling on November 1st. Wilcox is a longtime fan, who wrote a letter to WCW before playing in some college football all-star games about wanting to wear NWO on his helmet to plug the NWO. He ended up getting a thank you mark form letter back, and as it turned out, scored the winning touchdown in I believe the Senior Bowl. It was one of the All-Star games last season, and ended up doing a generic wrestling promo in post-matches without plugging NWO or anyone else. Former WWF prelim wrestler Mike Duke Droese is now working in Austria for Otto Wanz and with Rambo Sniper in WWF, having left the promotion vacating their world title. Dries is the new CWA heavyweight champion under the name Marshall Duke. Also working CWA is former WWF and WCW wrestler Carl Ouellet under his WWF ring name of Jean-Pierre Lafitte. A correction in the Fritz von Erich obit last week. Waldo von Erich's first wrestling ring name was Bill Shepherd, but his real name is Walter Sieber and he's living currently in Elmira, Ontario. Salvatore Sincere beat Tracy Smothers to win the title for Ian Rotten's IWA this past week as part of the NWA vs. IWA feud. Kenny Bolin, who was one of Jim Cornette's best friends as a kid, is there as a heel manager using a different name, and Cornette is behind the scenes helping out IWA. He sent a WWF Cornette tennis racket which Bolin uses as a weapon. Independent Pro Wrestling Alliance, IPWA, headed by Chris Jackson Cue Ball Carmichael, filed a lawsuit in Fairfax County General District Court against the Fairfax County School Board and Chantilly High School principal Dale Rumberger for $15,000 based on a breach of contract. Jackson claimed he paid the wrestlers up front for a show at the school on April 12 that wound up being canceled at the last minute in a very publicized battle over whether it was appropriate to use Iron Sheik, bad image of Arabs, women wrestlers, bad image of women, and midgets on a high school show. Andy Shallow, who heads the school board's Human Relations Advisory Committee, attempted to get the show canceled because of the ethnic stereotype of the Iron Sheik character. It turned into a very public feud between Shallow and co-promoter Kevin Heilbronner. EWF has a show September 28 at the San Bernardino Sports Arena. Century Wrestling Alliance on October 4 in New Britain, Connecticut Sports Palace has Abdullah the Butcher vs. Tony Atlas, plus Devon Storm, Ace Darling, Reckless Youth, Pitbull No. 2, Rick Fuller, King Kong Bundy and others. All Pro Wrestling returns to Hayward, California on October 3 at the Pacific Coast Sports Gym. The Chicago Sun-Times ran a brief regarding Tully Blanchard speaking at a local church on September 13. Green Mountain Wrestling on October 19 in Newport, Vermont at 2 p.m. at the Municipal Building. The television commercial for John Peretti's IWF pay-per-view show on the Barker channels was described as being something that wouldn't make anyone want to buy the show. It's black and white footage of what appear to be two high school wrestlers in the wrestling room throwing each other around. Former wrestling promoter David McLean, most notable for Glow and Pow Wrestling in the 80s, has resurfaced as promoter of a new sport, Pro Beach Roller Hockey, with a bank-playing surface and a ball instead of a puck, which will start in the spring on ESPN and ESPN2, taped out of Huntington Beach, California. Hey, maybe they can make Tank Abbott the commissioner? And Ann Calvello, at the age of 68, will be skating her retirement roller derby game on October 4 at Keyser Pavilion in San Francisco. NHB. The UFC pay-per-view show will originate from Casino Magic in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, a 2,000-seat arena on October 17. The Mississippi site was selected because the State Athletic Commission agreed to sanction the show, which was, as we've noted, what cable operators that refused to carry the show have listed as its objection. There is no movement within the cable industry as of yet, and it is believed that the universe will be roughly the same for this show as it was for the last show. Besides the Belfort Couture and Smith Severn matches and the heavyweight tournament, to round out the show there will be two alternate matches, both of which will air on pay-per-view: Dwayne Kaysen vs. Houston Dora, a local kickboxer of some name value, and Alex Hunter 1-0 vs. Greg Stott. Tank Abbott had yet another alleged altercation, this one taking place on September 14 with one of his friends, Eddie Ruiz. The two had a fight and Abbott knocked him out, then after knocking him out, knocked out his teeth. Ruiz had to spend 3 days in intensive care but has since been released from the hospital. Ruiz didn't want to press charges, but between this incident and the previous one with Abbott a few weeks earlier, he was arrested as he's been advised not to leave the country. Although this has not been announced in Japan, we're told the result of this is he'll be forced to cancel his match with Kimo on the October 11 Tokyo Dome show. Semaphore Entertainment Group's David Isaacs returned from Japan, and the tentative plan now is for the Ultimate pay-per-view to be called Ultimate Japan on December 21 at the Yokohama Arena. This isn't a done deal, but it is the current working plan, with the Smith Severn winner and Belfort Couture winner meeting for the title in the main event. There were two shows over the weekend. An IFC show in North Dakota on September 20th was headlined by Dan Severn beating John Renfro with a keylock submission in 2:28 to up his NHB shoot record to 17-3-1. It was said to have been an easy win for Severn. It's Severn's final match before the Maurice Smith match. Joel Sutton, who has a 2-0 record in UFC alternate matches and lost in rapid fashion to Minoru Suzuki on a Pancrase show, was knocked out in 1 minute on the undercard. The North Dakota Secretary of State Al Yeager, who doubles as the head of the Athletic Commission, attempted to get the show shut down, claiming it was illegal under state law, but since it was on an Indian reservation, he didn't have the power to do so. He tried to use political muscle by saying that the reservation, which runs sanctioned boxing shows in the same venue, would no longer have its boxing matches sanctioned if they didn't cancel the show, but they allowed the show to go on. Yeager was quoted as saying that he had never seen an NHB show, nor do I care to. Another show was on September 20th in Woodbridge, Virginia, featured a heavyweight tournament won by Paul Verlins. Mark Coleman had his knee surgery on September 11th. There will be a show called Absolute Fighting World Cup on October 19th in Tel Aviv, Israel, the first show of its kind in that country, while there will be another Russian Absolute Fighting Championships on November 29th in Moscow with Verlins, Brian Johnston, and Pat Smith, and a Russia vs. the World show in the same building on November 30th in which the world team will include Sutton, John LeBay, EFC, Pancrase, and Harold Howard, 1 and 2 UFC record. ECW. The return to the ECW arena on September 20th after 6 weeks drew a full house estimated at 1,600 with new bleachers adding to the capacity for what was termed the best set of matches in the building in a long time. With a lot of criticism about ECW being mainly sloppy brawling, Paul Heyman is trying to change the face of the company using more wrestlers underneath and in the middle. The advance for the show was below par and there were tons of discount coupons given out all over the area, which is a first to my knowledge for ECW Arena in years. The show opened with the FBI beating Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney. Balls had Little Guido pinned for a 3, but after the count, manager Tommy Rich, the big don of the FBI, put Guido's foot on the ropes. Ref Jeff Jones restarted the match and Guido pinned Balls. After the match, Jones got into a confrontation with ref John Finnegan about having blown the call, and Jones got a lot of heat doing a heel promo before Balls cracked him with a chair. Jason Knight introduced his new protege, Justin Credible, PJ Walker aka Aldo Montoya, with his head shaved a la Steve Austin. That's becoming contagious. He beat Jerry Lynn in a good match using a swinging DDT as his finisher. Heyman is really high on him as mentioned before. Chris Condito beat Lance Storm in what was reported as a pretty good match using the Blonde Bombshell, a power bomb off the top rope. Bam Bam Bigelow against beat Spike Dudley. The highlight was Bigelow doing the same spot with him as on the pay-per-view, throwing him into the stands, and the fans surfed him around ringside. Shane Douglas retained the ECW title beating Phil LaFon with a cradle. They are doing a gimmick to build up Douglas' credibility as champ by having him cleanly pin a variety of different opponents of different styles. The gimmick is that Rick Rude is trying to toughen him up by bringing in wrestlers for him to face. Although Rude wasn't at this show, he was at the WWF show in England instead. LaFon got no reaction coming out, but it was said to have been a good match. During the match, Francine gave LaFon a low blow and later LaFon gave Francine a power bomb. Doug Furnace was at ringside and got into it with Bigelow and would up with Furnace and LaFon being paired off with Bigelow and Condito, which will start a program. The basic details are Furnace and LaFon will be wrestling here for 4 to 6 weeks with Heyman attempting to inject some charisma into the team so they'll get over a lot bigger when they return to WWF, since they both have $250,000 per year guaranteed 3-year deals with Titan. Heyman wanted them because, in his own words, he's attempting to reinvent the promotion with more wrestling, and the two are quality wrestlers. When it comes to the lack of an ECW appearance on the Raw from Madison Square Garden, Heyman said it was because they told him about the Austin/MC Mahan angle and he knew there was nothing he could do that would get anyone talking about ECW with that angle, so he figured there was no point in appearing on the show. A WWF source categorized it as, no matter what you hear, WWF wants nothing to do with ECW as far as appearing on their television at present, but they are sending him talent, and that Heyman begged WWF for Furnace and LaFon and promised that in 6 weeks he'd give them a gimmick that would get them over when they returned to WWF. Next up saw the Pitbulls return, coming out with Lance Wright in a wheelchair, claiming that Taz beat up Wright outside the building. Pitbulls were total heels, and it wound up with Taz suplexing Wright through a table and doing a quick single skirmish with Pitbull number 2. Pitbull number 1 has a bad knee and can't work, and choking him out. Taz wound up hitting a fan at ringside, a plant, and Sabu came out to attack Taz. The story behind this was that Gary Wolf, PB number 1, called Heyman a couple of times the day of the show about money the two were owed before they were let go after the drug trafficking charges went public. After some phone tag, Heyman asked them to come to the building and work the show and he'd pay them what was owed. So he turned them heel to the crowd and basically buried them. The belief is that when the charges are dropped, they'll be brought back, but this was a one-time last-second deal. Sabu and Sandman went to a no contest. Sabu took a nasty cane shot to the eye and bled badly. At the end of the match, Sabu threw fire at Sandman. This was the first time fire has been used in the promotion since the incident where they had the near right with the lights out and the fire getting out of control. At the time they vowed never to use fire again. Tommy Dreamer and Beulah beat Rob Van Dam and Bill Alfonso in a mixed tag. Dreamer legit injured himself coming off the top rope to the floor with a chair and landing badly. At press time it was believed he suffered a badly bruised heel, also during the match suffered a shoulder injury. The extent of both injuries wasn't known at press time nor whether or not he'd have to miss this coming weekend. With him carried out, Van Dam simply walked out on the match for no real reason since the planned finish was Beulah versus Fonzie. They had worked out a few spots, climaxing with Beulah doing a Hurricane Rana for the pin. Before the finish, Beulah used an object on Alfonso, who bladed and cut a vein, needing 16 stitches. There were reports that Alfonso bled more than anyone ever at the ECW arena, and you can imagine how much that must have been. He was hospitalized due to loss of blood, although released later that night after being stitched up. The final match saw New Jack and Cronus win the tag titles from the Dudleys. This was made apparent the night before when New Jack did a promo claiming that he would retire from wrestling forever if he didn't win the belts the next night. The highlight was New Jack jumping off the roof in the front of the building. The report we got was that it took Joel Gertner forever to do his monologue before the match, and after 10 to 15 minutes of an interview, the guys went out and did a 5 minutes match ending with Cronus pinning Devon with a 450 Firebird/Scorpio splash. The previous night in Blackwood, New Jersey drew a sellout of 1,200 with Sabu over Dreamer on top. A match with Dudley's beating Axel and Balls ended in an impromptu three-way with New Jack and Cronus. PJ Walker turned on Jerry Lynn in a tag match where the two faced the FBI. Many of the spot shows are being sold to Dan and Heather Cole for either $10,000 or $12,500. I've heard both figures, and that the two are doing a great job of packing the place. It was noted that in Warwick, Pennsylvania, ECW ran on its own and drew only a few hundred. Then 1 month later, with the Cowles promoting a return show, they drew more than 1,000, and that they deserve a lot of credit for the area spot shows being way up. Next ECW arena is October 18th. Nothing is official, but Heyman was looking at Furnace and La Fawn versus Condito and Bigelow, and maybe Sabu versus Taz. Great Sasuke will be appearing on shows on October 16th, Queens, October 17th, Downingtown, Pennsylvania, and October 18th, ECW Arena. He'll likely face 3 different opponents, perhaps Condito in one match, Lynn in one match, and an opponent he brings in himself in the third match. Sasuke won't be available for the November pay-per-view due to prior commitments with All Japan, but ECW is attempting to lock him up for their February 1998 pay-per-view show. It appears that this upcoming ECW pay-per-view show will clear about 80% of the total universe. The previous 2 shows were at around 60%, so with the same costs, the amount of revenue coming in should theoretically greatly increase, even if the buy rate slips a little. Heyman stated this week on the internet that he's got so much confidence in his shows that from now on, if any fan that attends the shows doesn't like the product they've seen, they have until intermission and he'll give them a refund. ECW debuts on WRBW in Orlando Fridays at 1 a.m., WAXL in Montgomery, Alabama Mondays at 10:30 p.m., and WPTT in Pittsburgh has moved the time slot to Saturday at 11 p.m. WCW. Kevin Nash suffered torn ligaments in his knee on September 19th in Seattle. He appeared with a crutch in San Francisco the next night and flew home after the show, missing Nitro. The initial prognosis was that he was going to need surgery and would be out of action for 3 months, although there is the expected pressure to just get it scoped and come back quicker. But he is off all house shows and Havoc at this point, and Hall and Six will be defending the tag titles in his absence. Hall was complaining of a bad back and was said to be questionable for Baltimore, and the main event was scheduled as Luger and Giant versus Hall and Nash. Six had been given the weekend off but may be forced into going on the road due to the injuries. Nitro on September 22nd from West Valley City, Utah drew a sellout 7,923, 5,959 paying $141,756 for the planned night of upsets. It opened with Eric Bischoff threatening Larry Zbyszko, and then they showed a clip from the summer of 1996 when Kevin Nash power-bombed Bischoff through a table. Boy, have some people aged a lot in the past year plus. Rey Mysterio Jr. pinned Silver King with the springboard Hurricane Rana in 3:25 in a very good short match. After the match, Mysterio Jr. did a running somersault dive onto Eddie Guerrero at ringside, no doubt leading to a cruiserweight title match between the two at Halloween Havoc. Rookie Bill Goldberg pinned Hugh Morris in 2:24 after a suplex, after kicking out of the moonsault. Goldberg, who looked very much like Warlord, slightly gassed down, not like this guy didn't look gassed up, was a football player in the Falcons camp a few years back who they've been high on for a few months, and has done some worldwide and dark match tryouts. Goldberg wound up with a black eye out of the match. He definitely has potential because he was pretty mobile for a big guy and obviously was green. Gene Okerlund tried to interview Goldberg, who walked off. The gimmick they are trying to do with him is he's a mystery guy and nobody knows anything about him. Disco Inferno won the TV title from Alex Wright in 9:28 when both went for a crossbody block, but Disco wound up on top for the pin. The match told a well-booked story, although as wrestling it was a little below average. After the match, Jacqueline confronted Disco and threatened to tell why Disco had been gone for 6 months, and Disco got mad at her for bringing it up. It appears Disco is still going to have to put her over after all. I can just imagine what 99% of the viewing audience thought while watching this interview. Typical WCW schizophrenia. First, they think everyone is inside, so they do that angle because people know Disco got fired for refusing to put Jacqueline over 6 months ago. Then, on the same show, they repeatedly talk about Chris Benoit having a concussion when the 1% who knows the Disco story also know Benoit is in Japan. During the match, Wright did his trademark high-flying stomp from the top that he does in every match, and Tony Schiavone remarked, "I've never seen that move used before." Schiavone's work has improved a ton this year, but there are times where I wonder if he has this switch in his brain that doesn't allow anything he sees involving a non-main eventer to enter into the cranium. Scott Hall and Six came out and Hall taunted Zbyszko and challenged him. Zbyszko came out, but refused to get into the ring unless Six left, which he didn't. Hall challenged Luger to come out, but he wasn't there, and again they wondered how Hall would have known. It appears they are building up an angle where eventually it'll come out that someone has been feeding NWO secret info from WCW. Don't know who it'll end up being, but Bobby Heenan wants the role, and I'll bet it'll end up one of the announcers that goes heel and ends up as the voice of Nitro if Slash when it becomes an all NWO show. Hector Garza then came out and Hall was squashing him like a bug, and then began slapping around ref Mark Curtis. While this was going on, Garza schoolboyed Hall and Curtis counted the fall in 133 for upset number tres. Hall and Six destroyed both Garza and Curtis after the match. Ultimo Dragon and Juventud Guerrera and Lismark Jr. and Ciclo beat La Parca and Psicosis and Villanos 4 and 5 and 443 in a high-flying spectacular match when Guerrera pinned Parca with a spinning Hurricane Rana turned into a front cradle. They did a series of super dives before the finish. Lismark Jr. was working on a bad ankle. Roddy Piper came out and announced a Luger vs. Hall match for Havoc with Zbyszko as referee, and then promoted his match with Hogan. It was Piper's best interview in a long time. A real good performance, with the only snafu at the end when he referred to NWA for life. Meng and Barbarian beat Steiners in upset 4 at 5:25 when Meng pinned Rick clean with the Tongan death grip. Very sloppy match. Hogan, wearing a Flair robe with the sleeves cut off, did an interview with Bischoff talking about Flair and Piper. Seems Hogan and Flair are now on the same idea page, which is good for what appeared to be a very weak political base for Flair. Speaking of Flair, he was scheduled to do a telephone interview on the show, but for some reason that didn't happen. Savage beat Stevie Richards in a total squash in 3:15 with the elbow. Afterwards, Raven DDT'd Richards. It was supposed to be Harlem Heat versus Conant and Scott Norton, but Stevie Ray wasn't there due to a pulled Achilles tendon, which they claimed took place at Fall Brawl. The injury is legit and that may have been where it happened, but Ray worked all the house shows over the weekend, although it was clear watching him at the Cow Palace show that his leg was hurt. So they did a handicap match. Usually those are easy to get face heat, but not in this case, as it was pretty bad, lasting 2:28 before Vincent interfered for the DQ. Main event saw Hennig beat Jarrett to keep the U.S. belt with the Fisherman Suplex in 8:52. Jarrett had Hennig in the figure 4 when Elizabeth distracted the ref, and Savage came out and handed Hennig the belt, which he hit Jarrett with to KO him. The entire NWO hit the ring and destroyed Jarrett until Giant made the save as the NWO ran off and the show went off the air. They had 2 tryout dark matches before the show started. Bruiser Mustino, Mike Halleck, better known as Mantor in WWF and Tank of the Truth Commission in USWA, beat Damien Apparently it wasn't that bad due to Damien. The other saw Dandy and El Texano and Aztec Warrior, Black Warrior and Promo Azteca, over Super Astro and Oro Jr. and Pantera, the same Pantera who was on WWF television the previous week having a good match with Taka. Was told the wrestlers were nervous and it wasn't that good, although Warrior looked impressive. I don't know if anything is certain in regard to the Four Horsemen. We heard talk about the entire group disbanding with Flair going on his own as a single, and the group being put together again with Dean Malenko was the fourth member. There were complaints by certain headliners regarding Malenko's size and having to sell for him that have the potential to stand in the way of the latter. The political problems between the Hall/Nash faction and Flair continue to be pretty heated. They're cordial to each other, but the underlying animosity continues to exist. The Las Vegas pay-per-view will start at 8 p.m. Eastern on October 26th instead of the usual 7 p.m. pay-per-view start time. The other weekend house show business was very strong, with September 18th in Spokane, Washington doing $5,358 paying $89,315, September 19th in Seattle doing $7,752 paying $142,798, and September 20th at the San Francisco Cow Palace doing $8,518 and $150,773. They were averaging $7.23 per head in merchandise over the weekend. There were some problems with the shows, largely security problems. In Seattle, fans were pushing against a rail too hard in an elevated ringside section, and 3 fans either fell through the railing or over the railing to the floor because other fans were pushing them so hard and they were hospitalized. In San Francisco, the crowd was very violent when it came to throwing things, and 2 glass bottles hit fans at ringside, one cutting up their leg and the other their face. I've never been able to figure fan logic. The fans that were throwing stuff were almost all wearing NWO merchandise, but they were violently throwing things at the NWO wrestlers and popping when someone would get nailed in the head like Savage did blindsided with a plastic water bottle. The same guys they cheer. Besides the injury to Nash in Seattle and to Stevie Ray, Ultimo Dragon suffered a concussion in Spokane during his match with Alex Wright. The next night in Seattle they did a 35 seconds match, and in San Francisco did a 13:49 long match, although they stalled a lot before going to a pretty exciting finish. Nearly everyone I spoke with about the Cow Palace show thought it was terrible, but I thought it was a decent house show. In Right Dragon, it was never announced beforehand as either being a title or non-title bout. Then when Dragon won, he grabbed the belt and people popped thinking it was a title match. Wright then got on the house mic saying it was a non-title match, that the Dragon and all the fans were stupid thinking he'd put his title on the line in San Francisco. Wright got good heat. Mysterio Jr. pinned Conan in 10:20. I've never liked the matchup with the two because of the size difference and because it takes Mysterio Jr. out of his element, but they do work well together because of their long-standing association, and it was a solid match. Hennig beat Jarrett in 6:52 with the Fisherman. Nothing that bad but too short. Next was Luger and Giant scheduled against Nash and Hall for the belts. It was announced at the open of the show about Nash's injury and that Hall and Six would defend. Nash came out and broke a crutch over Giant's back. The guys stomped on Luger and Nash was ordered to the back. Giant just laid there as he did on previous shows, popping up to go to the finish. Problem was they were only out there for about 2:30 before Giant popped up and started the comeback. Luger racked Hall and Giant choke slammed Six. Before this, Dick Patrick was accidentally hit by Luger. Patrick got up and signaled for the bell and ruled it a DQ on Luger. All this lasted only 3:34. Giant choke slammed Patrick after the match. Pretty heated, but a lot of people felt majorly ripped off by a 3 minutes main event. Malenko beat Eddie Guerrero in 17:11 with the cloverleaf. In this case they made it clear it was non-title since Guerrero said he'd give Dean a title match should he win this non-title bout. Guerrero, who was ripped to shreds more than a bodybuilder in contest condition and more than any wrestler I've ever seen before, even guys juiced to the gills, was by far the best performer on the show, and this was easily the best match. In the other cities, they ran title matches and Guerrero won those. Steiners beat Harlem Heat in 10:06 in their typical match with some good moves but a lot of sloppiness. Finale saw a death match with Page over Savage in 10:01. Better than I'd been led to believe from reports in other cities, as the two did work and it was longer than they usually go. They changed the match for being pinfalls and a 10 count to only a 10 count and no pinfalls. In this case, Page got up at 9 after Savage's elbow. Then Savage got up at 9 after a diamond cutter. Then Page delivered a low kick and another diamond cutter, and this time Savage couldn't get up by 10. People were complaining that it was billed as a death match, and except for the 10 count, the wrestlers worked the match the same as every other match. In Seattle, The ring broke during Steiner's versus Heat, so Page and Savage really couldn't work and only went 325, doing a diamond cutter finish with most of the match outside the ring. Other weekend numbers saw main event at 1.2, Saturday night at 2.4 and pro at 1.4. Gorgeous George, Rob Kellum is scheduled to start in October. TSN in Canada will be running 2 hours of Nitro every Wednesday night starting on October 22nd. TSN already carries Raw on a tape delay every Monday, but the station turned down ECW saying it was too violent. Last we've heard, Rick Martel doesn't have a starting date yet. Perry Saturn will be out 4 to 8 more weeks after re-injuring his knee by coming back too soon in the match on September 8th. Despite what has been reported here and elsewhere, Saturn's WCW contract was 1 year for $100,000, and not for 3 years. WCW has seriously discussed bringing in Satoru Sayama for the Cruiserweight division, which would be a sensational acquisition if it was still 1983. Medusa is engaged to be married to Ken Blackman of the Cincinnati Bengals on Valentine's Day. The current idea is for her to return as Bischoff's bodyguard. While all this can and will change, the working idea is that after Hogan drops the strap, likely to Sting, although that isn't 100% at this point, that it'll be outside interference from Hall and Nash screwing up to cause the title switch and result in Hogan feuding with them in 1998. Louis Spicolli was offered a 1-year contract at $85,000. The advance for Havoc in Las Vegas has topped $200,000. Steve McMichael will be taking Flair's house show bookings against Hennig, including the match this weekend in Baltimore. Speaking of McMichael, he and Deborah are now separated in real life. They survived all those years of football and beauty pageants, and you can imagine the stress of those worlds, and it only took pro wrestling 1 year. Chris Cruz's contract expires next month and everyone figures that'll be it for him. He went to Eric Bischoff recently and asked him if the two had anything to talk about, and Bischoff simply said no and walked away. His being gone with the company had been rumored going back maybe 1 year. Buddy Landell was telling people at the IWA show this past week that he's still heading into WCW as the NWO Nature Boy. Weekly Variety had an ad trying to garner foreign sales for Shadow Warriors, the TV series Hogan is working on. They said they were producing 1 2-hour movie and 22 1-hour episodes over the next year, so it looks like Hogan is giving himself another project out of wrestling for bargaining leverage as well. WWF. The Madison Square Garden Raw opened with a nice clipping montage of the greats who had headlined the arena in the past, showing Hogan, Bruno, Slaughter, Patterson, Billy Graham, Savage, Piper, Andre, Ali, Moolah, Liberace, Snuka, Morales, Backlund, etc. Really an awesome open. In the IC title tourney, Ahmed Johnson beat Rocky Maivia in 4:57 with the Pearl River Plunge. Johnson cut up his hand banging into the ring steps. Austin did an interview from the stands promising to whoop some ass. Undertaker did an interview and Michaels came out on the ramp and gave him a tongue lashing. LOD beat Farouk and Kama Mustafa via DQ in 2:31 when D. Lo Brown and Rocky Maivia interfered. Pretty bad. Johnson did a run-in but they had the 4-on-3 on him. There was no heat for the post-match and finally the officials broke it up. They announced that even though Shamrock had beaten Farouk last week, that Farouk would advance in the tourney due to Shamrock's injury, so Johnson vs. Farouk would be a semi-final match taped on September 23rd in Albany, New York, since Shamrock wouldn't have been able to work and loose on a taping before the pay-per-view show since Albany was the last one. Owen Hart beat Pillman via DQ in 7:33. They announced Goldust and Marlena would renew their wedding vows on Raw on October 6th in Kansas City, which no doubt will either lead to or be an angle. Marlena came out wearing a dog collar and Pillman talked about giving it to her in the position with her bent over. The two started out by having a fake match, as opposed to a real fake match, until Marlena hit Owen with her purse and blamed Pillman. They came back and brawled for a few minutes until Goldust hit the ring and slugged Owen while trying to get to Pillman, and somehow it was ruled Owen the winner via DQ, so he goes to the final of the tourney against the Johnson-Farouk winner. Austin then jumped Owen and the Keystone Cops hit the ring to arrest Austin. McMahon jumped out of his chair and gave a speech to Austin about how everyone cares about him and just don't want to see him wind up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Austin acted like he finally understood they were acting in his best interest, then gave McMahon the stunner to the expected big pop. The police then cuffed Austin and dragged him out, and he bent over while in cuffs to flip off McMahon. Lawler and Jim Ross acted like Austin would be fired for sure for attacking the owner of the company. The gimmick, as best I can tell, is that Austin's matches will be non-sanctioned matches once he can come back, at least for a while. McMahon sold it as if he were dead, but once the cameras got off, people live thought McMahon got up too easily and walked off with Patterson. They aired a brief clip mentioning the death of Bulldog Brower. Ross made a comment after the McMahon thing in reference to Shivani walking off on the previous week's Nitro, saying he and Lawler weren't going to walk off their job and go boohoo over the incident. Lawler then interviewed Rhonda Shear of USA's Up All Night Movies, and Shear said she wanted to keep Lawler up all night and started rubbing him, and Ross came back with saying even Rhonda Shear can't raise the dead. It was scheduled as Dude Love vs. Helmsley in a Falls Count Anywhere match. They did a video where Dude Love said it wasn't his kind of match, but it was Mankind's style. Mankind then came out doing that gimmick and said there was someone who was an expert in this match and even better than him, and they both introduced Cactus Jack. The two had an excellent brawl. There were very loud ECW chants when Cactus first came out. Jack took all the hellacious bumps, and Helmsley took great bumps himself. They brought out a gimmick table and Helmsley went for the pedigree, but Jack gave him a low blow and a pile driver through the table for the pin in 12:29. Michaels did an interview and called out The Undertaker, doing almost a spoof of what was edited off the show last week, saying he knew he was there this week. Undertaker came out, but Helmsley ran out and the two destroyed Taker with a chair with help from Rick Rude. Taker finally got up and they scattered. Bret beat Goldust with a sharpshooter in 12:48 of a decent match. Bret wouldn't break the hold and Michaels and Helmsley hit the ring, attacking Bret with help from Rude and Chyna, which wound up with Owen Bulldog limping badly, selling the injury from England, and the return of Jim Neidhart. Funny to see Neidhart attack Rude, who by agreement isn't allowed to receive any blows due to his legal settlement with WCW. Rude didn't seem too happy about it. Bret didn't sell for Michaels either. Finally, Undertaker came out and the ring ended up cleared except for Bret, Michaels and Undertaker, and as the show went off the air, Taker choke slammed both at the same time. After the show went off, they immediately went into the dark match main event, which was a triangle match for the title which only went 5:30. Michaels worked in his jeans. Finish saw Taker tombstone Michaels, but Helmsley pulled Taker out of the ring, allowing Bret to jump on Michaels for the pin to keep the strap. Before the live Raw, Steve Corino beat Jimmy Cicero in a dark match that got no fan reaction, but Corino was said to have looked pretty decent. They announced a battle royal with the winner to get a WWF title shot on the next MSG show, and Brooklyn Brawler won. Jesse vs. Bret headlines the next show. Not. For Shotgun, Vader and Patriot beat Godwins, Savio Vega and Miguel Perez beat Blackjacks when Jose and Jesus interfered. Jesse Jean beat Flash Funk due to interference from Lawler, who tripped Funk, and Crushin' Chains, who got a big pop even without coming out on bikes, beat Recon and Sniper via DQ when Interrogator interfered. Don Callis, who was Rick Martel's tag partner this summer in the Maritimes, signed a deal and will be headed in. Yokozuna will be moving to Stamford, Connecticut, and is expected to return since he's still under contract. Shamrock was heavily fined for missing a shot in Albuquerque the night after the Chicago Friday night main event Raw taping. When Ron Simmons was honored last week at the Florida State football game, he was introduced as the world's heavyweight wrestling champion Ron Simmons, and there were a lot of people who chanted Farouk at him and he got a big pop. Scott Putski and Missy Hyatt did a porn movie video, aired on Manhattan Cable this past week. They do a shower sex scene, although Putski doesn't show his face. Hyatt also did stuff with women in the video. On a totally related but unrelated subject, it's amazing that the same company that airs this won't air either UFC or ECW on pay-per-view. Mark Marrow returned on September 19th in Poughkeepsie, New York with a shaved bald head doing a boxer gimmick. No word on why he didn't work on the MSG show since he was there. They are hoping to start Matt Ghaffari by the late October tour of the Middle East, but don't expect him on US television for a long time. Basil DeVito, a former VP, was rehired as Chief Operating Officer of Titan Sports, basically put on the same corporate level with Linda McMahon, behind only Vince McMahon. He's not going to have anything to do with the wrestling, but is there for the business end. With virtually all the headliners overseas, they ran essentially B-team shows over the weekend. September 19th in Poughkeepsie, New York drew $2,059 and $38,948. September 20th in Scranton, Pennsylvania drew $1,890 and $26,497, and September 21st in Liberty, New York drew $966 and $17,844. The latter would be the smallest WWF house show crowd of 1997. Including Madison Square Garden, the weekend merchandise totaled $133,482 or $8.56 per head. Last week we reported that WWF hadn't changed its policy on signs, but this week we received 2 calls from fans in Muncie, Indiana who said their signs were confiscated and it wasn't due to dirty language but due to it being positive about another promotion, in one case ECW, the other case WCW. One of the reasons for Slaughter in the current role is that Monsoon's health has gotten worse due to more complications from diabetes. Weekend numbers saw Livewire at 1.3 and Superstars at 1.5. One of the most talked about things of the past week was Jim Cornette's comments on the WWF Bite This audio show. I know a lot of people saw Arn Anderson's retirement speech a few weeks ago on Nitro. That was not only one of the greatest interviews I've ever seen, but one of the classiest things I've ever seen on a wrestling program. What Arn said and the way that he said it. But what I didn't see, but I've been told by a number of people, and I've read a little bit about, is this parody of it that the NWO Goofs did. I'm glad I didn't see it, because I probably would have thrown up. I heard enough about it, and knowing the people involved, I can imagine how mean-spirited it was, and what a big kick they all got out of it, because we all know how funny the NWO think that they are. It wasn't an interview because if you know these guys personally, you know they meant everything that they said and they abused their position to make little statements and little comments about people. I'm going to say this right out front. I mean every word I'm saying, and I don't care who knows it. It shows how little taste and how little class that the whole promotion has to begin with to do a parody of that interview, but I'm not surprised because of the quality of human beings that are involved. As far as the whole group of them goes, Conan couldn't draw money if you dipped him in glue and drug him through Fort Knox. Bagwell, I don't know, maybe he was just trying to keep his job. But Nash Hall and 6, I guess he's named after his IQ or the number of brain cells he has left. You know, all the fans think that these guys are so cool and they're so sweet. They got the easiest jobs in the world. All they got to do is go out there and be themselves, childish, obnoxious, adolescent smartasses with a bad case of arrested emotional development and a fixation on trying to act macho. In my opinion, Kevin Nash is one of the biggest no talents that ever stepped in a ring in this business. He's got 6 moves. No ability, and his one talent is that he has enough timing to cover up for some of it. He got into this business because of accidental genetics and because he had a multi-million-dollar promotion push him to the moon to make him a star. Then he leaves that promotion, the WWF, after giving his word that he was staying, so he's a liar too. He's had one good match in his career, and he had to pull a guy's wooden leg off to do that. He's made his entire living out of being a backstage manipulator. As far as Scott Hall goes, Scott Hall is a good wrestler. Good's about it, but he's the best of the bunch. He had the same multi-million-dollar promotional company make him a star after he'd been in this business close to 10 years without putting 3 asses in a seat. As a human being, he's about the quality as Nash in terms of honesty and or integrity. Which means if they tell you the sun is going to come up tomorrow, go out and buy a flashlight. You're going to need it. As far as 6 goes, he had a job because he carries the other guy's bags and they think he's cute when he gets drunk and throws up on himself. And that's the entire reason he's employed. He has the distinction of being, in case anyone hasn't noticed, the only guy on either side of the wrestling war to have been released from a valid wrestling contract to go and join the other side, which shows how valuable he is. For these guys to go out and try to make an ass out of Arn Anderson is ridiculous. He's one of the best talents to ever work in this business. He didn't get to be a star by having a multi-million-dollar promotion behind him. He did it with talent, hard work, and with putting asses in seats. Not going and whining to the boss. Not acting like a movie star, but by going out and getting matches and talent over. That was what was right for business, and as a businessman, you could depend on him because he was honest and took pride in what he did. There's not one of those jackasses that could launder his jockstrap, and the one thing that remains above all else in my opinion is that no matter who gets the last promo, or who gets the biggest contract, or who hangs out with the boss, they're never going to be able to change the fact that Arn Anderson was just plain better at what he did than they'll ever be on their best night, and that is non-negotiable. I'm sure Arn Anderson and Ric Flair are upset, and I wouldn't blame them if they did either one of 2 things, either quit or took a baseball bat to someone's kneecaps. The only reason the NWO guys are in the position that they are in right now is because Eric Bischoff, even more than being a mark for his own face and voice, is a mark for hanging out with studly guys with long hair that smoke cigars and ride Harleys, so maybe some of that can rub off on his little pansy-ass frame. So he throws a billionaire's money around to prove that his Johnson is bigger than the guys what put their own money on the line. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228, September 29, 1997. This is the end of this program. Thanks for watching. See you next time.